Chris, it's great that you could come in and join us this morning.
Thank you, Nick.
My usual first question is what's your earliest memory of Rutherglen, or what brought you to Rutherglen? But in your case, you actually came for a different reason. Can you tell us about your arrival here?
Well, my first experiences with Rutherglen would have been in 1974 when I was working. Well, I started with Lindemans, who had a significant winery at Corowa, and I came down to work there in an assistant winemaker's role, and because Lindemans was considered very much part and parcel of what in those days was really a north-east collective, because it included Rutherglen and Millawa and Glenrowan as well. And in those days, I think there would have been only around about 12 wineries in that whole northeast area in those days. So when I first came down to work at Lindemans, I got to know Rutherglen and know the people here before the company in their wisdom shifted me.
Okay, now you said you had an assistant winemaker role with Lindemans. Where was that winery?
Well, the winery was actually in Corowa. It was on the banks of the Murray in Corowa, but their vineyards were a little bit further out. It was quite a sizable operation. Lindemans had it was just on 400 acres of vineyard, all for the production of fortified wine. It was the fortified winery for the group in those days, so specialised in all the fortified wines. But we also made a lot of dry white table wine, which came from fruit that was sourced along the river. And that was in the days when white was supreme. Everybody was drinking white wine, so we made probably 10 times as much white wine as we did fortified wine.
Well, that's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
And had Lindemans built that winery?
Yes. My history is a little bit sketchy in that area there. They keep talking about the McWilliam influence in Corowa, and I'm not quite sure where that actually sits in relation to Lindemans, but what we call the original brick cellar was built by Lindemans, and so.
Right, and you arrived there, you say, in 74?
1974, in time for the first grapes. That's right.
Okay.
In fact, they'd started coming.
Right, and who were the people you worked with there?
Well, there we had, there were two people there. There was Ron Prince, who was quite almost really a legendary winemaker in fortified wine circles in Australia at that time. And also Andrew Burks was there as well. So it, when I went there, it was meant to be a small crush, but we did a significant crush that year because of the demand. And so I worked with those people who are really well known in fortified wines, and of course that led me into fortified wines because the interest level in fortified wines is really great, I believe. And of course, we were making a lot more fortified wines in those days as well because they were much more popular, and we were making the whole broad spectrum of wines.
And you say 400 acres of vineyard they had, so those were outside Corowa?
Well, yes, they were. The furthest one, I think, was 16 kilometres from the winery, but they had two vineyards there, and a lot of the famous fortified vintage reds, which we call vintage ports in those days, came from those vineyards there, which still pop up and surprise people. And I'm sure, Nick, you've tasted quite a few of them.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
And when did that winery stop operating?
That's right. After leaving in 1975, I was only there for that period of time, for 2 years. I came back in 1978 with the task of closing the winery.
That must have been a sad task.
Well, it is a sad task because the history to me was important, and everybody in town thought I could reverse a decision made in New York, and of course I had no hope of doing that. But I also had to relocate the winery, and would have been at least 12,000 barrels that had to be relocated. It wasn't a very small operation, and we moved all the tanks to Caradoc, which is near Mildura, and also Leo Buring, which was at Tanunda. So we shifted those, and I got on the last truck and went to Caradoc.
You went with them, okay.
Yeah.
And so, obviously we know you came back to the area, to Rutherglen, but how long were you at Caradoc or elsewhere?
I was at Caradoc for nearly 4 years, but I was in charge of all the fortified wines, so at Caradoc and we had significant holdings at Tanunda as well. But we also still had the vineyards here at Corowa, which were still being run, and we had a vintage processing winery, which I used to come back for the best part of 2 months a year to run that winery and make the wines on site and ship them out.
On the same site or elsewhere?
Well, it was on. We built a small processing winery on what was considered the better vineyard, because I think long term the plan was to sort of keep operating in that manner, but of course fortified wine sales declined, and they were even declining in the premium sector. It's only probably since we've started that we've seen that turnaround in the premium sector. There's been certainly it's levelled out, and in lots of cases sales are growing in that premium sector for people.
Okay.
So, but the story is why it was quite interesting. It was during vintage I was down here, and another big company by the name of Seppelt had made a decision to leave the district as well. And I was in the middle of vintage, and you know what happens in vintage, that things break down, and I had to take a pump to get rewired, a motor to get rewired, because a pump had broken down, and I was dry. I had to take it to Wangaratta to get it rewired, and for some unknown reason that day I decided to drive down Distillery Road rather than go down the normal road that most people would take, and I drove past this for sale sign which was on the Seppelt properties there, and I sort of had 20 minutes to think about it before I got to Wangaratta. And then another 20 minutes before I came back and saw the sign again. And I can remember ringing Robin up, who was in Mildura, and saying that, I got an idea. And what do you think? And she really enjoyed her time here. She enjoyed her time at Mildura too, so that was another wrench for her to leave Mildura. But and we decided that we would have a go, and lots of things contributed to that decision. One was that it was considered one of the birthplaces of wine tourism in Australia, Rutherglen, with their festivals, the Rutherglen Festival as it was in those times, and leading into the winery walkabout and the strong cellar door trade that had developed here. So that was an opportunity to actually crack into a market that was already there for me, and it's not a bad place to live.
So, when did you move into Distillery Road?
We moved into Distillery Road on the, on the 29th of December in 1984. And the Pfeiffers arrived in Australia on the 29th of December in 1838. So I've just made that link myself. And
that sounds like destiny.
It must have been destiny, that's right. So I must tell Robin about it when I get home. So we moved there, and we got some help from people in the district, because we were, one of the advantages we had was we were bought vineyard. So if you start with a bare patch of dirt, you don't have to, there's quite as quick decisions to make about how you're going to make wine. But we bought a 55-acre vineyard, which is a reasonable amount of fruit to have to look after. And so we got some help from people around the district that got us through the 1985 vintage. We had wineries that were closing in that time. I can remember there was a Mudgee winery, which was about the same size as us. We loaded the semi-trailer with gear, and we still have some of that gear. But and brought it down here and got ourselves set up to actually start crushing on site in 1986. And as many people will know, it's quite an attractive site. Created a few challenges for us, being on the creek, but it's been nice to capitalise on that. And when you're crushing away and you're tired and vintage and you've had enough, you just look up and look at your view and it's pretty good.
That's great.
Yeah.
And the vineyard was around the winery, was it? Right
Well,
next door?
yes, we have the famous Pfeiffer Bridge, which goes over Sunday Creek, which leads us to the vineyard as it was there, which had a lot of unusual plantings on it, and had absolutely no fortified grapes planted on it. But it would have had the largest planting of Pinot Noir in Australia at that time. It was 10 acres of Pinot Noir planted in 1961 and 62. So we're talking about quite a pioneering site, and had a fair hunk of Chardonnay as well. And it had Gamay, which was also, and then it had it did have a small planting of Portuguese varieties, which they weren't mixed, they were in rows, but the only way you could process them was to mix them all together. So we had 26 different varieties, which were quite experimental. And you would well know that Carl Seppelt, who was running Seppelt's all through this time, was a viticulturalist. He wasn't a winemaker. So you got slightly different bent as to what was happening, and I guess that's seen with a lot of what Seppelt's did. So.
Okay, intriguing.
But we actually then, another vineyard, Seppelt's vineyard, was bought by another couple, and we actually ran that vineyard for them, and that actually had the fortified, it had Muscat and Muscadel on it, and Cabernet as well. So we ran that for a number of years, and before we then planted more vineyard ourselves.
With fortifieds, did you, now obviously the fortifieds that Rutherglen specialised in rely on old stocks of wine.
Sure.
For complexity and consistency. Did you have to start from scratch, or were you able to get
I started from scratch.
So that must have been a big challenge.
It is a big challenge, and not many people do it, as you've probably noticed. To build your stocks up, to get to a point where you can, as we are now, where we, what are we, 33 years down the track, or 32 years down the track, where you've actually got stock that you can start making, or releasing some of these old wines. But yeah, it's a huge commitment, and to build all that stock up, and it's sort of kept us bound to the vineyard, because there's no surplus cash when you do that sort of thing.
You mentioned one of the attractions was the Rutherglen Festival, and which developed into Walkabout and so on. So did you have good cellar door sales immediately, or did you have to appoint a distributor as well?
Well, we had cellar door sales immediately, whether they're good or not is a matter of opinion, of course. Certainly they're not as significant as they are for us today. But to be able to, and our license came through 5 days before the winery walkabout of 1985, after a long process of trying to get it. So and once again, our fellow winemakers in Rutherglen were very generous, and sort of, because we weren't officially part of the event, because we couldn't commit, because we didn't know when our license was coming through. But the lawyer convinced the judge at the time that being able to feed our children was important, and we needed cash flow. And the judge commented he'd never heard that one before. So anyway, we got it, and we kicked off with that, and then slowly our sales have built over the years. But and we've run a lot of events as part of that, and we became involved very heavily in the Winemakers of Rutherglen, and worked towards maintaining Rutherglen's status as in Victoria, particularly as one of the premium winery tourism destinations, and which of course has been suffering challenges ever since as more and more wine regions get up, and for us, to refresh ourselves is very, very important, because we're having grandchildren of people who used to come.
I'll come back to that theme in a moment, but while you were talking about the help you got from the locals in those early years, who were some of the characters in the industry then?
Well, of course,
helpful, notorious, whatever you care to say.
Well, like when I came here in 1974, the Rutherglen Vignerons, or the Vignerons dinner as it was known, which was based on the first Thursday luncheon group out of Sydney. I don't know if you know that. And first, it was where the Penfolds and Lindemans and McWilliams came together to do a similar thing, and Ron Prince brought that back to the district, where you come and put a bottle of wine on the table, which was masked, and discuss it. So I came in 1974 and was occasionally invited to the venerable senior vignerons dinner, because as all these functions, you only want one bottle, so that limits how many people you can have. So every now and then you get used to get to those things and those events, and there's not many people left who were at that original table. Colin Campbell springs to mind. He was at that table back in those days, and if I run my mind around it, I think that's it. But we did, there was a lot of characters who were very earthy people down there. Keith Gayfer was a quiet person, but he was quite an earthy person. Of course, Gayfer doesn't exist anymore. And we had Barney Geary, not Bernard, Barney. So his dad was there, and he was very matter of a fact person who was probably used descriptors for wines that wouldn't go onto the back of labels. And of course we had back then the influence of both Lindemans and Seppelts, I think, was very important. And I think a number of people would acknowledge that, because they, having people from two larger companies, they could bring back a lot of the experience they're picking up when they go and work within their own companies out there, and that contributed a lot to those tables. So Brown Brothers were also part of that table, as were Baileys at that time. So we had John C. Brown was a member of the table, and Harry Tinson at that stage, the Baileys had sold to Davis Gelatine, I think it was.
So Alan Bailey was no longer around.
Yeah, so it was Harry Tinson had come down to take over there. So, and of course we had George Smith, who was there as well, and he
was that senior or junior at this stage?
That was junior. Yes. So I actually never met George Senior. So, but he had a big reputation round town, so as being a colourful character. But George Junior in his own right was another colourful character we had there. Of course, we had Mick Morris, who was at the table, and we don't see much of Mick anymore, but he's a cattle farmer now, as we know. And this year was the first year I think he's probably not been to the Rutherglen Wine Show tasting. He wasn't there this year, so. But in the tradition of having Mick and David, we had David and Madden this year. So father and son there.
How have you seen Rutherglen change over those years? And well, obviously your initial role was at Corowa, but the knowledge of the Rutherglen area from those early years. How do you see it change?
Well, I think particularly the closure of Seppelts had a little bit of a setback for Rutherglen, because when you look at the prominence of an area or prominence of the brand, it's handy if you've got some good distribution. And in those days we had really good distribution probably with Seppelts, and so they were promoting the name in lots of marketplaces and also Morris's. And when Seppelts went, of course, you lost a significant part of that. And with Morris's, that was kept going through various ownerships they had, but they had the power of a larger company to actually give them distribution, which is, when you're a small winery, is the key. How do you get distribution? So having those two was very supportive of the brand and the prominence of the brand. But the development of tourism, I guess, in that stage has been quite significant in terms of what the group has achieved over those years. Was to take an event like, basically from 1974 it was Winery Walkabouts. 1974 was the last Rutherglen Festival and the first Walkabout. And to build on that and build other events around it so that you could maintain tourism, and to get the group as a collective to invest more significantly in winery tourism, to the extent that the Winemakers of Rutherglen were the catalyst for the Tourist Information Centre in Rutherglen. And by that I mean we put significant amount of money in to do that, and bringing professional staffing levels to the organisation to keep promoting it, because tourism is critical to Rutherglen. There are some people who do not sell outside of Rutherglen who are members of the group. So tourism is critical to us, and with fortified wines, which are it's extraordinary. We have fortified wines and all the glory it brings to Rutherglen, and the glory is international. It's not just in Australia, in terms of having that great halo sitting above us, so that hopefully shining down on everything else we do. We've actually got to keep that going too, to be the caretakers of Rutherglen Muscat, and which is of course the wine style which is acknowledged all around the world as being quite special, and hopefully Rutherglen Topeka is going to follow, comes along with that, and we spend a little bit more time on Rutherglen Topeka and build that. That will always bring a lot of attention to us here, and to me that's very, very important. That can then flow through to the other wines, because there's no doubt about it, we all need table wines. I can't build stocks of fortified wines in my own winery without cash flow. And so then finding our niches for what varieties are going to work here, I think we're still exploring that in lots of ways in this region. Shiraz, of course, has a home here, but something special to us has been Girif, and of course Girif has become widespread in Australia now, but its birthplace in Australia was here in Rutherglen, and with Keith Gafer and Morris's, they were two very important people in the development of Girif in this district. So we like to think of Girif as being having its spiritual home here in Rutherglen as well, and people still like those big alcoholic wines, despite what the health advocates tell us. They still seem to really like those wines. So, in terms of how we develop other varieties, the whites to actually complement that range, I guess there's been a tendency, there's been a favouritism towards the Rhone white styles here, but I think we've still got a long way to go as to where we will probably find some, there's lots of parts of the world which have a lot of similarities to Rutherglen, which makes some nice white wines, and those varieties really haven't been explored in this district, and I think there's still great potential. So that's exciting. That's for the next generation. I'm too old.
Oh, come now. You inherited some Portuguese red varieties on the vineyard, and they've become quite a specialty for you now, haven't they, in the vintage fortified area?
Well, yeah, we sort of went down that path, and of course in my time at Lindemans we were well and truly on that path as well, so it just seemed to follow that I would continue that path, and sort of Chris Colleen and I at the same time basically were sourcing material to put in our vineyards for the production of vintage fortified red wine. And basically we settled on, because of availability, of course, because a lot of this stuff's still not available for us, but with Touriga Nacional, Tinta Barocca, which we now have to call Tempranillo, Tinta Cow. Oh, sorry, Tinta Oriz, which we have to call Tempranillo, Tinta Barocca, and Tinta Cow were the main varieties that we had. The Francesa that came in, the Tinta Francesa or the Touriga Francesa, died in quarantine. So it's to bring all these varieties in, they've got to go through quarantine. It's a reasonably expensive process, and I think Yalumba also had trouble with it dying as well. So whether the Portuguese have decided not to send us the good stuff, because we're obviously threatening, because we're not allowed to use their name. So that we came down that path with those, and of course when Tempranillo became pretty fashionable, we had old vine Tempranillo because it had been in the ground for over 10 years, and for us, before we made a table wine out of it. And of course we still make a table wine out of it. So there's opportunities in our district for something like that, for Tempranillo to be grown in this district, as well as a lot of the varieties that have existed, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula, which I think have got potential in this district. There's both white and reds there that not even they know they've got, which I think potentially could come. I know a lot of talk's been about Italy and northeast Victoria in particular. There's been very little out of the south, and so southern Italy may have an opportunity here as well for us, to give us varieties that can retain acidity for us.
Okay. So you talked about the way things are evolving at the moment with visitors, with generic promotions by Rutherglen and so on. So what are your hopes for the future for Rutherglen? The town and the wineries?
The town and the winery. I think that if it's still got a great future as a tourist destination, and there's been a lot of work to maintain that heritage outlook of the main street. And so that's important for us. At the moment, the bulk of our tourists are centred around wine. To get a little bit more activity in the main street would be good, but that probably needs to take them a little bit away from that wine theme. Even though for one stage there, the main street of Rutherglen was known as the eating street of northeast Victoria, because of the quality of the restaurants that were there. And we're starting to see that come back again now. We lost a few restaurants, and we're now starting to see more restaurants coming back, which will build that reputation of the wine and food reputation. We then have to probably more link into the history of northeast Victoria. Rutherglen has a gold history, which not many people talk about. It's all about Beechworth when you talk about gold. But we have a gold history. The Rutherglen Cemetery has Chinese burning towers as well. All Saints has their Chinese dormitory. Waganya, where we're located, was the centre of the Chinese workforce for this region, and we've got links into people. We never seem to have actually capitalised on our links into Elizabeth Chong. the Chinese chef whose grandfather was the virtually the head of the Chinese in Waganya.
Is that right?
Yes, yes. So his daughter used to come to our winery because we were one of the few places who used to put Waganya on things. And she didn't drink wine, but she liked to have a glass with Waganya written on it, or a wine cooler with Waganya written on it, so she could put her flowers in. So she obviously still felt a link to it, and so we have these opportunities to link into there, and I think from the wine perspective, even though we have a lot of members who aren't really concentrating on making fortified wines, I don't think we're going to be able to reinvent the wheel, and I can't see any reason to do it myself because we've obviously made the investment in both Muscat and Muscadel, and we've got this halo that hopefully my daughter is going to keep polishing it, so that we can keep that beam of light up there for us and for the district. It is something special to have a wine style like that, and it can be because familiarity builds contempt, and we've got to be careful.
Okay, and it's wonderful your new generation is very well ensconced in Pfeiffer wines.
Well, we're lucky we have a daughter who's really keen, and we're lucky that she's keen about fortified wines as well. There's not the same glory in fortified wines as there in table wines out there in the consumption land, but to have someone who's committed, and not only to just Muscat and Muscadel, but we're committed. Who is the last winery in Australia who significantly set up an Apera brand, which is, if you're talking about something that's difficult to sell, that's quite difficult to sell, and it's expensive to make, but we're committed to that as well as the fortified reds. So we're across the whole spectrum of fortified wines, and hopefully we keep that candle burning, and I guess with the wine show and trying to put some more emphasis on that and to make it reinforce that Rutherglen's often seen as the spiritual home of fortifieds, that we're trying to build on that as well.
I'm glad you mentioned the wine show because obviously you've had a very big role in that over the years. Can you tell me a bit about the show and the direction in which it's moving?
I can, Nick. The wine show was a very small wine show when it started. It's been running this year we have the 128th Rutherglen Wine Show. So there's a long history. When you add the 8 years of the two world wars when it didn't run, so wine judging started 136 years ago in Rutherglen. Judging occurred before that in Waganya. And that's right. So there's a long history of peer review, and very much we've used that peer review as the main driver of what the wine show is, rather than being a marketing exercise, even though of course people will always use it to their advantage if they've done well. And when the wine industry really expanded, the position of the Rutherglen Wine Show had always been to have outside entries, because it to them, and in those days, and I guess there's still a bit of a belief of that at the moment, is the peer review is not only internal, it's also external, as to where you actually sit in the whole scheme of things and how you can benchmark your products against not only your fellow winemakers in a 50-kilometre radius, but also what you're going to compete against on the shelves when you get out into the real world, because the tendency of having a cellar palate to become a regional palate, I think, is still very real. It's not a view that's supported very widely from my reading of the situation, but it can still be very real, that whole role. So trying to ensure that Rutherglen winemaking stays at a higher level, that's what we would like to use the show for, and it's been quite beneficial to have all these wines come in for people to come and have a look at their wines and sort of benchmark themselves, because it relies very heavily on the exhibitor or the winemaker in the region to actually do that, and we certainly encourage that. With the fortified wines, I guess we just wanted, and setting that apart, we wanted to reinforce that this is still an important category. What we've found with fortified wines around the country is that most people aren't putting them in wine shows anymore. And so we thought it'd be great to try and encourage a show which has a very strong emphasis on that ultimately we may be able to use to benefit the category as a whole. Not only just within Rutherglen, but outside that, to use that as a mechanism to, bring attention back onto the fortified wine category. It's sad. Melbourne didn't have an Impera entered this year, not one. And Rutherglen, I guess, had the most of any wine show. I think we had just short of 20 across the 3 Impera classes. And so we're trying to encourage that so that there is an opportunity for people to just see where these wine styles are.
And how would you like your contribution to be remembered? In general. We sort of have a philosophy at home that we like to make wine, and we like to make it well. We also like to make it to be enjoyed, and to be enjoyed with friends, and that's important to us. That in what we try to do is that we see wine as a wonderful thing to share. As a winemaker, we're sharing with our customer, and then our customers can share that with something else. And but it'd be nice to know you did a pretty good job. But I think we'll also be known for fortified wine long term. I think because we have invested in that significantly, and we are still investing in that significantly. And I think we'll probably be known as a pretty good producer of fortified wines long term. And hopefully around the edges they think, oh, it doesn't make a bad table wine either. Okay. Well, Chris, it's been great that you've been able to come in to talk to us about your memories and your hopes for the future. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Nick.